Hello students, this is Professor Chalai, and in this video I'm going to go over some of the things that you might need to know for the Intermolecular Forces labs. In this video, I'll start by going over what are intermolecular forces, or IMFs, and I'll talk about what you might need to know to connect IMFs to temperature changes. And then finally, I'll go over some of the things that you'll need to know for the lab itself and the procedure of the labs. So let's start with intermolecular forces. And instead of going over all of intermolecular forces, I'm just going to go over some of the basic remind you of the three different kinds of intermolecular forces that you might encounter in this lab. And the first is dispersion forces, the weaker of the three sets that I'm going to talk about. But this occurs for all atoms and molecules, right? So even though they're the weakest, every single atom or molecule would have dispersion between them. There's also a dipole-dipole, which only affects polar molecules. And then there is the third one I want to mention for today is hydrogen bonding, which affects hydrogen connected to fluorine, oxygen, or nitrogen. So those are the three that we're going to see a lot of today. Now, just to remind you, right, I've laid them out here in order of strength, right? Dispersion is the weakest, hydrogen bond is the strongest. But that doesn't mean dispersion can't be strong as well. For example, the larger the atom or molecule likely means that the stronger the dispersion force. Okay, so at this point, I want you to think about, let's consider the molecule methanol. So methanol has formula CH3OH. I want you to think about this molecule and consider its Lewis structure and figure out all the kinds of intermolecular forces that might affect methanol. Okay, so if you're thinking about the Lewis structure of methanol, it's carbon connected to three hydrogens, like this, and then to this oxygen and hydrogen, and then there is the lone pairs on the oxygen. Oxygen is more electronegative than carbon or hydrogen, which means that it'll have a slightly negative charge, right? So in methanol, we'll have dispersion like all molecules. We will have dipole-dipole because it's a polar bond. This oxygen is pulling on the electrons, and even though I drew it in a straight line here, really what I should have drawn is this at an angle. Because of the lone pairs, it forces this hydrogen to be at an angle. So there is a net dipole moment, so there is dipole-dipole interactions as well. And because it has a hydrogen connected to an oxygen, it will have a hydrogen bond. So methanol will have these three kinds of bonding. Okay, so what are we going to explore in this lab? We're going to explore the strengths of the intermolecular forces for a number of molecules. And so you might be asking, how can we test the strength of the intermolecular force of a molecule? Okay, so let's consider a sample of liquids, and let's examine this graph. And a sample of liquids, on the y-axis I'll put the number of molecules, and on the x-axis I'll put the kinetic energy, or how fast those molecules are moving. And let's say for a particular temperature we have a distribution of kinetic energy that looks like this, right? So basically there's some molecules that are moving very slowly, some molecules are moving very fastly, and a lot of molecules moving with this amount of kinetic energy right here. For a low intermolecular forces liquid, you don't need a lot of energy to break those intermolecular forces to become a gas. So maybe you only need this much energy to break those intermolecular forces. That means that all of these molecules here will vaporize because they have enough energy, right? So all of these molecules would vaporize. That's a lot of molecules vaporizing, which means that all of that energy to vaporize, to break all of these bonds, will come from the temperature of the surroundings, so you'll have a big temperature drop as these low intermolecular forces molecules vaporize. If on the other hand we have some high, let's use a different color here, a high intermolecular forces liquid, right? That means they'll need a lot higher kinetic energy to break those intermolecular forces before they can vaporize. And so only these molecules will have enough energy to vaporize, and that energy will come from the surroundings. So since it only needs a little bit amount of energy, it'll be a low temperature drop. All this is to say, to summarize, for molecules as they vaporize, if they have a high intermolecular or strong intermolecular forces, it'll lead to a low temperature drop as they vaporize, whereas a weak intermolecular forces liquid will result in a large temperature drop. So that's the principle that we're going to use in this week's experiment to study how these molecules, with the strength of the intermolecular forces in these molecules. Okay, so what are the basics for labs today? Well, we're going to explore a whole range of liquids, and we're going to check how much their temperature will drop as they vaporize. And to do that, we'll need a temperature probe. So imagine this is our temperature probe that connects to the computer. And on the tip of that temperature probe, we're going to use a strip of filter paper that we're going to wrap nicely and tightly around there with a piece of wire. That strip of filter paper will help soak up the liquid that we're going to test. You're going to get test tubes of liquids. It's a really bad test tube, but that's okay. And the test tubes of liquids will be nicely capped because they're easily to vaporize. So you'll uncap them, soak the tip of the temperature probe in them, and then when you're done, you recap them. So what you're going to do is, as you're soaking the temperature probe in the liquid, you're going to start your collection, and it's going to give you a certain temperature. At some point, after maybe about 30 seconds or so, you'll take the temperature probe out of the liquid, and as you do so, the liquid will start to vaporize, and as it starts to vaporize, the temperature will drop because it cools down the environment as it does so. At some point, the liquid will stop vaporizing because that's all the liquid that will vaporize, and then the temperature will level off again. This drop in temperature, that's what we're focused on. That will be the delta T, the change in temperature that we're going to be interested in. So this is the basics of the experiment today. We're going to create this temperature probe wrapped in filter paper. We're going to soak it in liquid, and we're going to see how much the temperature drops as the liquid vaporizes. And you're going to do this, we're going to have two temperature probes going at the same time because there's a number of liquids, and we're going to make sure they start at the same time. So you're going to have two different graphs going at the same time. So on the screen you should see a second graph with the same process going at the same time, and they might not happen at the same rate. So the two temperatures might drop at different rates because you'll have two different samples of liquids to test at the same time. So as a reminder, as always, be prepared for lab, dress appropriately, bring your eyewear. You must print before you come to lab. Here's the IMF data and results sheet that you need to print and bring. And you also, before you come to lab, print and complete the before you come to the lab. That's the name of the PDF sheet. So print this and complete it, and then also print the IMF data and results sheet and bring that as well with you. I will see you in labs.